and welcome to Book Beat. Our guest today is Roger Barr. He is the author of a book called Getting Ready for Christmas. And welcome, Roger. Thank you for coming to Book Beat today.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
Tell me how you conceived of Getting Ready for Christmas. You said in the book's foreword, you never set out to write a series of stories about Christmas or issues of faith.
One of the things that writers get asked about most often is where do their ideas come from? And this is a classic example to the answer is that they come from out of nowhere. So it was a Saturday morning in November of 1996. I was on my way to the barber shop. I was walking down a street in my neighborhood. I went by a shop window, and there in the display portion of the window was a nativity scene set up. And I looked at it and it was very well appointed. It was very pretty. And the thing that flashed through my mind was, gee, our faith is always stronger in the holiday season when we can see those symbols in front of us. And I thought, wouldn't it be great if there was a big one that you could just walk into and become part of? What a faith builder that would be. So I went on to the barbershop and I came back and that idea stuck with me. And so I started playing with that. How did it get built? Who built it? Why did he do it? And then stories have to have conflict, so I created a son who had some conflict and had to go through their history, and the story created itself into using the nativity scene, life-size, lifelike 50 figures to interpret a family conflict. And from there, there's the next year, this story was published in a community newspaper called The Villager in 1997, and it's the only fiction this newspaper has ever published, this series of stories in its 60-year history. And I always tease them and say knowingly published there, and they laugh too. So I wrote another story and sent it to them the next year, and they passed on it. So I know what to do, so I wrote a sequel. They picked up the sequel because it was set in the same neighborhood, same characters, and that created a tradition. And in December, assuming they accept it, the 17th story in this series of holiday stories will be written or published.
Oh my goodness, that is a long-standing history of your stories. And how do they relate to one another? Is there an overarching theme?
There wasn't when I started out. When I said in the foreword that I didn't set out to write a story, a series about faith, is that this was a one-off story. It was just kind of nice, and it had some good emotion in it. It made readers cry when they read certain parts of it. So it was a one-off. And the next year I could lean back on that story and do what sequels do, is finish something or tell something additional. But then it became, this is a tradition, what connects them? And so over a period of time, it developed as a franchise, the way a television series would, where you had certain things that you had to honor each year, and you needed to introduce other characters and things. So the overreaching theme of this series, that it is the faith journey of the central character, Matthew Bartholomew, who is the son in the original story. And he is conflicted about his faith, and so we follow him through a succession of years. I like to say, for people who are fans of the Chronicles of Narnia, when you go into Narnia where it is winter but never Christmas, it's just the opposite in this book. It's always Christmas, because all of the stories take place in the holiday season from one year to the next. So it turned out, these 13 stories, being a short novel written one chapter a year over a 13-year period.
Wow. And you said the story was published chapter by chapter in The Villager. Can you tell me about the relationship with The Villager, how that came to be?
I've worked with The Villager as a reporter on and off for 20-some years. I covered business and politics. I've covered the state legislature for them. I've done features on books and other materials. So we have a long relationship. And it was a gamble to send them this short story because they had never published fiction before. And when I finished it, I sent it to the Pioneer Press, the daily newspaper in St. Paul, and they passed on it. They said it was a good story, but we just don't do that, although they do once in a while. And so the next year, I just gave it to the Villager as covering all your bases. I had no expectations, and they picked it up, and that started the tradition.
Oh, that's terrific. Now, what about getting back to the characters of Getting Ready for Christmas? Who else is a part of the family?
The story begins with the creator of the nativity scene, John Bartholomew, setting it up, and his son has been drafted to come in from the suburbs into this central city to help set it up, because you learn very quickly that John Bartholomew, the father, has a terminal illness. This will be his last Christmas, and he wants to set this up in its splendor. There is Mary and Joseph and the infant Jesus in the stable. There is a donkey and cows. There are the three wise men and their camels, the shepherd and their considerable flock. 50 figures in all. I won't tell you why there are 50 figures there, because that's a key to the story itself.
Okay.
But the son, Matthew, is drafted to come in and help set it up. He has things that bother him about the nativity scene. He thinks his father invested all of his time in doing that rather than being a good dad to the 8 brothers and sisters there. And so he thinks, well, when this guy is gone, he'll vote to get rid of this stuff because it's been a pain in the neck all these years. And he will learn some things that will change his mind as he goes on. So the nativity scene is this huge life-size, lifelike set in the yard that is so real that people looks so real that people actually think it is real. And there is one thing that happens during the course of this series where a little boy comes up and knocks on the door and asks why they don't let Mary and Joseph and Jesus sleep inside where it's warm. And so we meet Matthew as the son in the first story. His father dies between the first story and the second story, and then Matt became the central figure through the rest of the stories.
Okay.
He has a wife and 2 children, a girl and a boy, and other siblings come in and out of the storylines. There are other characters that are introduced to deal with themes that I've worked with through the years. Again, you'll see in the foreword that this series has looked at family issues, faith issues. It's investigated social issues like racism, poverty, class. And so the stories have been inspired by local and national events. One story was modeled after incidents from 9/11. Another one was based on the 2004 presidential election. There's a afterword in the back that explains what all of the different stories got in terms of their genesis, what trends I was following or what issues inspired me to start writing and create a story.
I'm especially interested in the relationship between John and Matt. You said that Matt didn't like being drafted into helping his father.
Father's nickname in the family amongst his 8 adult children is Silent John. And someone accused him of being a member of the silent generation, and he said, well, he pays his dues every year. So he's happy about that. He's a typical Midwestern, Northern European, Scandinavian male who's very guarded in what he says about his inner feelings and goes along about his business. And fathers and sons and mothers and daughters have things that occur between them, rules and unspoken rules that are sometimes violated. And so there's resentment in Matt's mind towards his father for reasons he can't really articulate. And his father doesn't think in those patterns, and so he's somewhat unaware that his son has these kinds of issues. So John is only alive in the first story, but his presence and his legacy continues to be with the family throughout the stories. He comes and goes in different stories.
So that's an overarching theme too.
Yeah, it is, but it is the way for people who are my age, whose parents are gone, is how did you become who you are? What role did your parents play? And you do become your parents. I look in the mirror now and I see my dad looking back at me from the mirror. I look at my 24-year-old son and I see myself when I was a young man. And so we do become our parents, and Matt understands that, but he thinks he can improve on the model a little bit.
I understand what you're saying about seeing your parents in the mirror. I'm my mother's daughter for sure. It's very interesting. Talk a little bit about the social issues that you cover. And
the issue that's most prevalent in there is the issue of hunger. And I have now had that theme run through since the stories starting in 2004. The first couple of years, the nativity scene, this 50-piece nativity scene, was used to interpret family dynamics. And then in 2001, I used the nativity scene to move into actual faith issues. I didn't realize that's what I was doing that at the time. I had a plot idea, because you start running out of ideas on the same theme. So I had this plot idea, so I did that, but it turned the corner and it opened me up to starting to write about faith. When I got into about 2003-04, worked a little bit in that issue, and I did a piece of research for other work that I was doing. And it changed my life, this piece of research. You know, we all think, oh, you know, we're just working along, grubbing out our day-to-day living, you know, and gee, wouldn't it be nice if we had some wealth, if we were rich. There's a piece of research that says no matter what your income level, $10,000 a year or $10 million a year, if you had just 20% more, you'd be rich. Well, I looked at the median income in America. And then I found out that we are in the median income of America, so ordinary Americans are in the top 10% of the world's population of 6 billion people. I've never felt poor since I saw that. It absolutely changed my life, my perception of things, and I realized how good I actually have things. And so we went in from the idea of gifts, what the wise men give. I started thinking about, well, what can we do about hunger issues that were rising in the community then? And so I introduced a food shelf to the plot. Matt has the same revelation about his comfortable status as I did. He decides to collect food there. He knows where the gourmet coffee shops are, but he doesn't know where the food shelves are in his community. And so it starts a learning experience for him there. And we the next year introduced the idea of doing a reading for a food shelf and giving the profits from the reading to the food shelf. So every year since 2004, we've done a reading and given our profits to there. We've sold these little tiny booklets that my wife put together for a donation, and then the money getting there. The book, Getting Ready for Christmas and Other Stories, is a collection of the first 13 stories of this 17-story series now. And my friend Lonnie Jordan, who lives in our neighborhood, who was a big fan of the stories and pushed me to put them into a collection, is responsible for the fact that the book exists. And I didn't really want to get into the rigors of a book at this point in time because I wasn't sure what its audience would be. But when we decided to make it an instrument for food shelf benefits, then I decided to go ahead. So we collected these 13 stories. I went out and did calls amongst friends in the creative industry and made cold calls, and we got most of the production costs for the book donated.
Oh, wow.
And we gave 100% of the profits to food shelves in the community. We've worked with several through the course of the book, life of the book, and the life of this series. And these stories have generated, now we're past $25,000 in contributions and growing.
Oh, that's tremendous.
That's enough to feed the city of Rochester once.
Oh, wow. That is outstanding.
So another issue that I have dealt with is the issue of racism. And it comes about in small ways, but the way we got into this is an interesting story in and of itself. There was an incident in one of the stories in which the police are required. And so I wrote out the story the way I needed it to be in the piece of art, but I wanted the police work to be accurate. So I contacted a friend of mine who was on the St. Paul School Board at that time and said, do you think your husband, who had recently retired as a police officer, would read this story for me and correct my mistakes about the police and how they worked and what they called their car? Did they call it a squad car or a cruiser or something else? That kind of thing. And she said, oh sure, he'll do it. I'll tell him he has to. So I met with the police officer. His name is Melvin Carter, Jr. And we met at a restaurant, and I have a habit of going in and sitting so I can keep my eye on most of the room and especially the door. He came in, and the second he stepped in, I knew who it was, although I never met him, because he made this sweeping glance with his eyes like this to take in the entire room the way a cop would. He walked over to me, and the first words out of his mouth were, we have to switch places. I can't stand to have my back to the door. So I agreed, since I called him and asked him, and we swapped places, and he promised that if anybody came in with a gun drawn, he'd shout out a warning to me so I would be ready to go. So we sat down, and he had read the story and he liked it a lot, and I was so grateful for what he had done that I changed the name of the character in the story to Officer Carter. Officer Carter, the real Officer Carter, is an African American man, and I knew that I couldn't pick up his name and leave him as a white character. It would not be appropriate to do that. So I changed Officer Carter to an African American policeman in the story. That opened me to a whole new area to explore here. And people who read the book will see how the issue of race has raised itself up.
What organizations benefit from your activities?
Different ones have.
Okay.
We've supported the Emergency Food Shelf Network. We've supported the Neighborhood House in St. Paul, and this year we're supporting Keystone, which is a community organization in St. Paul and has a food shelf.
Oh, okay. Interesting. You mentioned the other work that you do, the other writing work that you do. Could you talk about that a little bit?
In all, Getting Ready for Christmas and Other Stories is my 9th published book. I have 7 nonfiction titles and 1 novel. I'll do the nonfiction first and get them out of the way. They were works for hire. They are nonfiction books read by junior high school age students on social and historical topics. If I can remember the order, I wrote a book about America's involvement in the Vietnam War, biographies of, what a contrast, Richard Nixon and Malcolm X, a book on urban issues, one on the history of radio technology from Isaac Newton seeing the waves of a prism or light come through a prism to Telstar in outer space, a book about juvenile crime, and one on the importance of the American frontier. The frontier started at the Atlantic coast and worked its way all the way to the Pacific coast over a 300-year period, and how that ever-receding frontier of opportunity in front of us influenced the American character and how it grew. So those were nonfiction work for hires, didn't pick up royalties from them. I wrote a novel about the St. Paul Winter Carnival and the Pioneer Press medallion hunt held every year during the St. Paul Winter Carnival. This book follows 5 different sets of characters searching for the medallion. The medallion search is a metaphor for their search for personal happiness of one kind or another. So there are 5 sets of characters. There is a loner computer expert, a young couple who were just married and their honeymoon literally is ending and figuratively as well. There is a pair of guys who are about 30, blue-collar guys who've been best friends for all their adult lives, who are at a crossroads in their friendship. One wants to move up into the white-collar world. The other one is mired where he's at. And then there is a retired man whose brother has just died. He's been retired by choice other than his own. His company closes down, and he's lost, and so he's searching for some direction in his life. And lastly, there is a family that has been transferred from Boston, native Boston, to St. Paul, and just they spend a year getting settled, and the husband has an opportunity in either Denver or San Diego, and he wants to move again, and the wife puts her foot down and says, I don't want to do this again. So their search is, what are they going to do? So the chapters alternate, and you get to follow these 5 storylines, see what they interpret the clues of the treasure hunt. I wrote my own set of clues. They interpret the clues, and also readers who are familiar with St. Paul could interpret the clues themselves and solve the treasure hunt on their own as they watch the reader or the characters try and do so too. Fans of St. Paul will find lots of descriptions of the city's various neighborhoods to look at. It's a book that all of St. Paul can embrace. It isn't just St. Paul's Summit Avenue specific or just about downtown or something like that. In addition to writing book-length material, I've done journalism for years and years, and done standard reporting in business and politics. I've done lots of feature work. I worked in the publishing industry and magazine publishing for about 10 years as the director of circulation, editorial, and production for an international trade association that published magazines, 4-color trade magazines. We had 36 issues of deadlines per year, and worked 60 to 80-hour weeks. Lots of time to keep up with those deadlines, but I learned how to write, and I learned how to edit. And when it comes time to take a story completely apart, having been an editor really is a very valuable skill for a writer to have. I've been eviscerated by editors many times over the decades, and I have done my share of taking writers apart to get at the best quality of work, and it really has helped me be a stronger writer.
Excellent. Talk a little bit about your process of writing. Do you write daily? Do you have certain things that you do to get your creative juices going?
It's a job that you go to and spend your days at. I worked in public policy for about 16 years after I was in trade magazine publishing. And so I was an executive director in management, and I've always seen that when I was in management, my creative work outside of my job skyrocketed because I needed that outlet. So my writing process is different for a short story than what it is for a longer piece of work. For a short story, you start with what you got, and you figure out what it is. Whether is it a theme, is it a character, is it a plot idea, or just a description of a place. All those things can be starts of a story. And then you start looking at, well, what's not here that needs to be here, and you start adding those different components of what fiction is. And it's sort of like rolling a pie crust. You roll it this way a while, and you roll it this way a while, and then you roll it another direction. And eventually a structure comes around, and you can figure out what you're doing and go all the way to the finish. When you do a longer piece, for me, I have to have a loose outline in my head or even on the page, and I write that from beginning to end. But in short stories, I jump around wherever I've got an idea or know what I need to do. I'll put that down. It's the shark method. Sharks drown if they stop swimming. So keep swimming, keep writing, always move. And even if you don't know what you want, if you have a sense, if you want somebody to be angry, you write angry down in the margin to help you find how to say that person is angry there. Something else I've been teaching in some workshops working with senior citizens on writing their life stories is to help them see writing as a whole. And it's a 4-stage process for me, and this is what I teach. And I ask who has writer's block? And everyone raises their hand. I have writer's block all the time. I don't believe in writer's block personally.
Okay.
And the reason why I don't is you are stalled in not knowing what you need to be doing. But the idea of not being able to write because I don't know how to write is not an issue for me. How to do it is the issue. So writing has, first of all, it has content. The second thing it has in it is organization. If you don't have content and organization going for you, that's when you're stalled and don't know what to do. The third and fourth parts are more technical. You have the standard rules of grammar and punctuation that you follow, and then you have your own personal wordsmithing. If you know what your content's going to be, you put it in the order then you're ready to do the writing part, and the writing part is usually easier. When I'm stalled, and I get stalled in work often, I have to think, well, what am I missing? And usually I don't know what my content is. And the content is just the things that you're going to have in it. And instead of trying to write the sentence, write down what needs to be in that sentence. And so I just jot things down, and you'll have pages of notes, and then to the organization process for me is to go through and actually number them. You know, I'm a guy who grew up writing on a typewriter, and computers are God's gift to writers because it makes it so much easier. But we'd have to retype all the time, and so to avoid having to type something, I would number the paragraphs in the order that they needed to be in to create my organization, and then I'd actually type the draft. And I still do that because I'll print things out. Sometimes you have to get them out of that little square that the computer has and lay them out so you can see the relationship between the pages, and then you go through and do this numbering thing for me. And that's, I work short stories that way, and I work chapters of books the same way.
Yeah, cut and paste is a godsend. For
It absolutely is, and you can do things like, well, I don't know whether that paragraph goes here or here. Well, put it in both places for now. You will decide later as you get farther along, you'll be able to answer the question of which place that paragraph belongs.
Okay. Talk about your background. Talk a little bit about how you got into writing. What would you like to share with us?
I'm an Iowa farm boy, and my family lived on a small farm, 200 acres in north central Iowa. In 1965, we bought a dairy farm in southern Minnesota, about halfway between Owatonna and Rochester, for those who know southern Minnesota geography. When I was 18, I graduated from high school in a class of 39 kids, and in the fall, I came up to Hamline University to start my freshman year in 1969. I graduated with a history major in 1973. Worked for the Minnesota Historical Society for a number of years, and then literally my position was not refunded by the state legislature, and in budget cuts I lost out at the Minnesota Historical Society. So I kind of drifted for a number of months. I got a grant from the State Arts Board and worked on a juvenile novel that was never published, and then drifted into publishing. Joined several magazines as the low man on the totem pole, and I was the overhead killer. Once they started paying somebody, they ran out of money and suspended publication. I did that 2 times, was the guy that they hired that eventually broke the company. And I ended up at this trade association, and I was there 10 years. I was the entry-level editor, and I was the head of the department for 5 years there. One day I realized that I actually wasn't having fun there anymore, and so I left. I freelanced for a number of years and was doing a business article with a guy, and I went in and did my interview, and he asked me a lot of questions during this interview, and I felt like I'd been interviewed as much as I'd done the interviewing, which journalists don't like. They don't like to answer questions, they only like to ask them. And I interviewed this guy, he was a real estate developer, a couple more times over a period of time, and he called me one day and said, I need to talk to you. And I thought, well, either I've got him trained or he's got me trained, because he's got a new piece of real estate and he wants some coverage about it. And so I went in, and instead he said, we've talked about social issues in the community, education in particular. What would it take for you to come and figure out what we need to do in education, and then get me started on how to do it? So I went into this not expecting to change or add to my career. I ended up being there 15 years in public policy, and then wrote on the side. So I've written professionally all my adult life, but a lot of it has been as an avocation rather than full-time. Now at the end of 2012, I retired from public policy work to write full-time. I didn't want my tombstone to say he was going to write another book. So I zeroed in on this. I'm fortunate enough, going back to that medium American income, that I can do this. And so I'm a full-time writer specializing in fiction, although I've done some playwriting work also. My first ever play was an award winner and produced. I didn't know what I was doing, but I intuitively got things right.
Cool. And it was
It was a 10-minute play. I entered it in a contest, and I was one of the winners. There was a number of plays selected
Yes.
for production. It's an international contest, more than 200 entries from around the world. And my 10-minute play, Decoration Day, about a family dealing with the loss of a soldier son killed in, pick the war of your choice, the Iraq War, the Afghan War. Now it can be set really any time. And it takes place on Memorial Day, or Decoration Day as it was called when I was growing up. And so it looks at the impact of a death on the family.
excellent. That's an interesting topic in itself, of people dealing with death. The idea of how Matt dealt with his father's death in the story.
Dealing with loss is a reoccurring theme in the Christmas stories and Getting Ready for Christmas and other stories. And one of the things I've always been careful to do in this series of stories is to not be syrupy and treacly or chlorine. These are not Hallmark kinds of stories. They have hard things in them. They have people die. People are beaten up, tough things happen. And for me, the challenge is, how do you go on? How do you learn to accept what happens to you and being grateful that you've got tomorrow and push forward? And so learning to build a faith-based life. There's a phrase in the book where Matt's faith is shattered. He's always looked at it in terms of these images, and one day he's not able to do that, and so he's searching, and some stranger that he talks to, who could be an angel or could not, depending on your point of view, says, "Well, you're going to be okay, and you're going to do this, aren't you?" And Matt says, "I don't know. I don't know." And so Matt says, "Do you have faith?" to the guy, the stranger. The stranger says, "Yes." And Matt says, "In what?" And the stranger says, "I have faith in the possibilities that lie before us." It doesn't go into whether those possibilities are divinely inspired or random, but they're there. And that statement is the thing that drives this series of stories through. And I think that Matt puts color and definition on it as he goes forward too. His faith deepens from that. But that has been a great line for me, and it came out of these stories, and it's actually how my life runs, is I do have faith in the possibilities that lie before us.
Oh, that's a wonderful saying and a wonderful philosophy to be following. Let's shift gears here a little bit and talk about the treasure hunt a little bit more.
Okay. The treasure hunt is still in print, although it's not as easy to get a hold of as it has been in the past. The book was something I started to write when I was probably in my mid-20s. And I started with an idea, and I think I mentioned earlier that there was a young married couple. That was the storyline that I started with, because I was a young married guy back at that time. This has been in probably the late 70s, early 80s when I first had this idea. And I wrote in for a while, and I stalled, and didn't really have the understanding of how I worked and the understanding of how to get unstuck. I did believe in writer's block at that time. So I got stalled, and I put the project aside and came back to it 6-8 years later and started again. And interestingly enough, the chapter that I had started on, the first attempt at this book, was the 5th chapter when I actually finished the book. So these other 4 storylines came out of just new experiences and new ability that I had that I didn't have when I was trying to do this the first time. So what you read as a reader of this book now is a second shot at this. And it had a structure for me because it had to take place during the week of the treasure hunt. So you had Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, and so on. And you had clues that came out. They came out 2 a day there rather than 1 a day, which they do now, because it was a morning and afternoon edition of the paper.
Right.
Now it's just a single daily, and so they published the clues over 12 days. There was over like 6 or 7. And so there was some element of structure, and I knew that all I had to do was advance the storylines there, and the characters actually never meet.
Really?
Until the very end. There's some incidental meetings, and they do have impacts on each other, but it is not a story in which the people know one another. So these 5 storylines, because most of the people who look for the medallion don't know each other either.
Right.
So the city gave me a lot in doing this. The structure was already there, and all I had to do was just embroider these stories in and around that existing structure.
Okay.
I still go back sometimes, and we'll pick this book up from time to time, just open it to a random page and see what's there. And I can remember some of these pieces that I wrote really well. In most of the work that I do in this book, I'd have to hunt for the page, but I know exactly the moment where it stopped being fun and it turned into work.
Oh.
And every piece of fiction that I do has that moment in it when it stops being fun and it turns into work. And then you have to use a different skill set. So for this book and for other things too, the writing process generally goes this way. You start out with some piece and you identify it as a plot, a character, a theme, and you start making your notes. And if you've ever been in workshops where you write your stuff and put little Post-it notes up on the wall, you know,
right.
And we're going to say now we're just taking ideas, and every idea is a good idea. We're not going to prioritize this. We're not going to say whether this is a good idea or not workable. All ideas are good ideas. There's a period in your writing that way. And it's really fun. Oh, I could put that in. Oh, I could put that in. And you're just scribbling this stuff down or typing it in as fast as you can keep up. At some point, you actually have to organize this stuff.
Right.
So it starts to tighten up a little bit. And then there's a point where you're having to give so much to it to get the story going. And it suddenly turns into work because you have to make those judgments on those ideas. This one stays, this one goes. This plot line works, this one doesn't. This theme, I can't figure out how to do it, so it goes on the floor, cutting room floor. And you keep going there through this, sliding along. It's work, it's work, it's work, it's work, it's work. And there's this old saying there, how far can a bear run into the woods? And the answer is halfway, because from that point, no matter where he goes, he's running out of the woods. And the story reaches a point like that, where you finally are in the heart of it and you know what you're doing. And then it starts to actually give to you rather than just take out of you. And then it's sort of like taking the back off of a watch, and you can see all these gears running and how this little gear influences this one and the ticks and the rhythms and things like that. And you can see how the piece works as a whole. That period just before you get to the middle of the woods, there is what I ingloriously refer to as the piece of crap stage. And I'll say that to my wife every day. How's your story coming? Oh, it's a piece of crap. And that word has mostly a scatological meaning now, but if you look in the dictionary, it actually means refuge and things like that. And we give it the scatological meaning. So it's a safe word actually to use in a program like this, because I'm using that word, not the scatological meaning. But anyhow, it just isn't working. And then you hit that center point, that moment when you were like the bear halfway through the woods. And from then on, things come along and you get down to the end, where you reach those magic words, the end. You used to type drafts over and over again. You know, when I get to the words, the end, that's my first draft in writing on a computer, because you're cutting and pasting and moving around in there all the way through. Even with this book, and now it's pushing 20 years ago that this came out, I go back and I read things and I don't usually feel, oh boy, that's not very good. I wish I had done something different there. I wish I had done something different there. I do 2 reads that are very specific when I finish a piece. One is what I refer to as the dumb read. We all have stuff in our heads, and that stuff influences what goes on the page, but sometimes it doesn't go on the page, but it's there for you. And the next person who comes along and reads this doesn't have that history, and they are confused. They don't know what this means. So you read it as though you're reading it for the very first time to see, did I leave something out that I should have put in? Did I explain something too deeply, et cetera? And you satisfy those kinds of questions that a first reader could have. The other major read that I do is to go through and read, and anytime I touch on a sentence, a word, a paragraph, anything that I don't like, reading and hearing clunks and goings and things as you're reading along, and I go back and say, why did this have a sour note to me? And you work to fix it.
Right.
And I do that for everything that's in there until, in my mind at least, when you read that piece, it's the equivalent of hitting a tuning fork on the table and everything is in harmony. That's when I know I'm done with a piece. I never go back and revise them after that. I'm done, and I read them 8, 9, 10 years later, and I'm still satisfied with them.
That's amazing. That is really an interesting process and an interesting way to do your work.
And, you know, people, I do workshops with people, and you can't teach somebody how to write. You can only share with them how you do it and how it works for you. They pick out of it if it works for them. This method, I have a friend who writes it completely differently than what I do. We both do good work, but our methods are nowhere near each other. And he'd come back and say, I can't do it the way you do it. I have to do it this way. And I said, well, then do it that way. Know what works for you. You know, and I talk to people about writing, and say, okay, so you're going to go on a trip. Tell me what kind of packer you are. Do you open your suitcase and start throwing stuff in? Open the doors and just, I'll take this, I'll take this, I'll take this? Or do you sit down and make out a long list of what you're going to take and then are very systematic about your packing? Possible that you write somewhat similarly. Don't try and be opposite of what you are. Just understand what you are so you can exploit how you do it and know what you need to do to do it. And I've had people come back. I've had one person come back through the years and say, well, I pack this way, but I write the opposite way.
Way to think about it. I'm just thinking the way I write versus the way I pack. It's, I think I do the opposite. I'm a list maker when I pack, and I kind of go all over the place when I'm writing. Very interesting. As we wind up today, is there anything else that you'd like to share with us? Is there anything I've missed?
I have a new book finished, but it's not sold yet. So I'll tell a little bit about that. And I was walking, or I was driving actually one day down Lake Street in Minneapolis to my wife's 50th birthday party. And I had this blip of a thought of the Wizard of Oz seemed like a good metaphor for the president. Once you've been the wizard, what do you do? Once you've been the president, what do you do after that? And that led to the writing of a book whose my title is, and publishers pick your titles ultimately. My title is Humbug, The Untold Story of the Wizard of Oz. And it is the story of the Wizard of Oz in the original novel from 1900 by L. Frank Baum, not the Judy Garland movie from 1939, but it is the story of the Wizard of Oz told from the wizard's point of view. You have 20 years of him being in Oz before Dorothy comes, and then you have Dorothy's story. And it is a political allegory on the nature of leadership. It was a fascinating story to write. That one idea on Lake Street ended up with a 220,000 word story.
Oh my goodness, that is a sizable manuscript.
That's a Stephen King doorstop size manuscript.
Okay. You have a website, is that correct?
We have a website for the book. To learn more about Getting Ready for Christmas, go to www.gettingreadyforchristmas.org.
Okay. We thank you for joining us today at BookBeat. We look forward to seeing you again.
Thanks for having me.
You're welcome.